They say you never really know your own child until money changes hands between you. I used to think that was something people said to justify their bitterness after a bad loan. I never thought I'd be the one saying it. I never thought the person who would stand in my kitchen and rewrite the truth right in front of me would be my own daughter, the girl I taught to ride a bike on Maple Street, the woman I walked down the aisle with my hand shaking so bad I nearly dropped the flowers. My name is Walter Higgins. I'm 64 years old. I live outside Tulsa, Oklahoma, in the same house I've lived in for 31 years, the house where I raised 2 kids and buried a wife. And for the past 4 months, I've been carrying something heavy in my chest that doesn't have a name. It's not quite grief. It's not quite rage. It sits somewhere in between, and it wakes me up most nights around 3 in the morning, staring at the ceiling fan, going in slow circles, just like my thoughts. And 5. This story starts, like most stories about people taking advantage of you, with me trying to be a good father. It was a Tuesday evening in early spring. I remember because I was out in the backyard, kneeling in the dirt. Planting tomatoes starts the way my late wife Carol used to do every April. Gardening was her thing, not mine, but after she passed 6 years ago, I took it up because it made me feel close to her. My knees aren't what they used to be, and I was grunting my way back up to standing when my phone rang on the porch railing. I saw the name on the screen and smiled before I even answered. My daughter, Megan. Megan is 34 now, married to a man named Trent Caldwell, mother of 2 little girls, Ruby and Nora, who call me Pop Pop and leave sticky handprints on every window in my house whenever they visit. Megan works as a dental hygienist. Trent runs a company that installs solar panels, or at least that's what he tells people at barbecues. I never fully understood the business. I spent 38 years driving a delivery truck for a regional grocery distributor, and anything involving spreadsheets and investors made my eyes glaze over. "Hey, sweetheart," I said, wiping dirt on my jeans. Her voice was wrong, not the bright, chatty voice I was used to. It was thin and tired, like she'd been crying, or trying not to. "Dad," she said, "I need to talk to you about something, and I need you to not freak out." That's the sentence that should have made me freak out immediately. Anyone who tells you not to panic is handing you a reason to. What's going on? Is it the girls? Is it Trent? "Everybody's fine," she said quickly. "It's the business. Trent's business. Dad, it's bad. It's really bad. It's really bad." I sat down on the porch steps, the phone pressed hard against my ear, my heart already sinking into my stomach. Megan explained it in pieces, the way people do when they're ashamed. Plays, and Trent had taken out a loan to expand the company, bought new equipment, hired 3 more installers, signed a lease on a bigger warehouse. Then, a huge municipal contract they were counting on fell through at the last minute. The bank was threatening to call the loan. Payroll was 2 weeks away and there wasn't enough in the account to cover it. "How much are we talking, Megan?" She hesitated so long I thought the call had dropped. $40,000. I closed my eyes. $40,000. That was almost a third of what I had left in my retirement account. Money I'd built up over 4 decades of loading trucks at 5 in the morning. Money that was supposed to carry me through whatever years I had left. Money that was supposed to mean I'd never be a burden to my kids. "Dad, Trent doesn't even know I'm calling you," she said, her voice cracking. "He'd be furious if he knew. He's too proud to ask. But I don't know what else to do. If the business goes under, we lose everything. The house, the girls' school, everything." I thought about Ruby and Nora. I thought about their crayon drawings taped to my refrigerator. I thought about what it would do to Megan to lose her home with 2 little girls in it. "I'll help," I said. "Whatever you need." The relief poured out of her in a rush of gratitude, and underneath it, something that sounded almost like tears. She promised, over and over, that it was temporary, that Trent had a new contract lined up with a housing developer that would set everything right within 90 days, that every dollar would come back to me the moment it closed. "I promise you, Dad. I swear on Ruby and Nora, we will pay you back every cent." She swore on my granddaughters. She didn't know it, but that phrase would live in my head for months afterward like a splinter I couldn't dig out. I told her I'd wire the money Thursday morning. She thanked me until I finally had to tell her to stop. that this was what family did, that I loved her and I loved those girls and none of it mattered more than they did. After we hung up, I sat on that porch step for a long time. The sun was going down behind the Ferguson's fence line, turning everything orange, and I remember feeling this strange hollowness, like I'd just agreed to something bigger than I understood. I told myself I was being an old worrier. Family helps family. That was the whole point of having one. And I didn't tell my son, Danny, about the loan. Megan asked me not to. She said Trent wanted to handle it quietly, get back on his feet, and surprise everyone once the business was thriving again. She said he didn't want anyone thinking less of him. I understood that pride is a heavy thing for a man to carry, and I figured the last thing Trent needed was his brother-in-law knowing he'd had to go through his father-in-law for a rescue. Thursday morning I drove to my bank, the same branch I'd used since 1994, and I wired $40,000 to Trent Caldwell's business account. The teller, a young woman named Priya who always asks about my garden, printed the receipt and slid it across the counter, and I remember looking at that piece of paper for a long moment before folding it into my wallet. I walked out to my truck feeling like I'd just given away a piece of my future and trusted a stranger to hand it back to me someday. Weeks passed. Megan called on her usual Sunday schedule, and we talked about the girls' softball season, about a recipe she was trying, about the weather. She never brought up the money. I figured that was a good sign. I figured no news meant the contract had come through and things were stabilizing. I didn't want to be the father who hovers, who calls asking, "Did it work? Did it work?" like some anxious old man who doesn't trust his own daughter. So, I waited. I let the silence be good news. Then, about 6 weeks after the wire transfer, Megan called with an invitation instead of a worry. "Dad, Trent landed the developer contract. It's huge. We want to celebrate, throw a little get-together at Trent's parents' place this Saturday. Nothing fancy, just family and a few close friends. Will you come?" I felt something loosen in my chest for the first time in weeks. It had worked. My money had done exactly what it was supposed to do. I told her I wouldn't miss it for the world. That Saturday was one of those perfect Oklahoma spring days, warm without being hot, the kind of sky that looks freshly washed. I put on my good shirt, the green plaid one Carol always said matched my eyes, and I drove out to the Caldwell place, a big 2-story house on 5 acres out past Bixby with a pole barn and a long gravel driveway already lined with cars. I could hear the party before I saw it. Music, laughter, the clatter of a horseshoe game somewhere behind the house. I walked around back and found a yard full of white folding chairs, a smoker working overtime, and Trent standing in the middle of it all in a crisp button-down, a beer in his hand, laughing with his father and a couple of men I didn't recognize. When he spotted me, he lit up like I was the guest of honor. "Walter, there he is. Come here, come here." He pulled me into a one-armed hug and clapped my back hard enough to sting. "Glad you made it, Pop. Let me get you a plate." For the next hour, I watched him work that yard like a man running for office. He shook hands, hugged aunts, let his daughters climb all over him for photos, laughed at every joke told to him twice as loud as it deserved. I stood near the smoker with a paper plate of brisket, talking to Trent's uncle about the Thunder's playoff chances, when I heard Trent's voice rise above the crowd, telling a story to a cluster of maybe 8 or 9 people. And I was staring down the barrel of losing everything, he was saying, shaking his head like the memory still hurt. Banks wouldn't touch me. My partner wanted to walk. I didn't know what I was going to do. And I felt a small swell of pride building in my chest. Here it comes, I thought. He's going to thank me. And then, Trent said, spreading his hands, my father-in-law stepped up, "Walter here." He pointed at me across the yard, and every head turned. This man believed in me when nobody else did. Didn't even blink. Just wrote the check. That's a father-in-law right there. That's what family's supposed to look like. Trent's mother put a hand over her heart. Somebody said, "Amen." Trent's father raised his glass in my direction. I lifted my plate awkwardly in return, a piece of brisket sliding dangerously close to the edge, because I didn't know what else to do with my hands. He didn't say loan. He didn't say pay back. He said, believed in me. He said wrote the check, like it was a gift I'd been dying to give him, like there'd never been a promise attached to it at all. I told myself I was overreacting. Maybe he just simplified it for the crowd. Maybe he'd correct it later. privately, man to man. 2. I finished my brisket and let people come up and squeeze my shoulder and tell me what a generous man I was, and I smiled and thanked them, because what else could an old man do in the middle of somebody else's celebration? It was later, near the dessert table, that I noticed Megan wasn't smiling anymore. She was standing off to the side, arms crossed tight over her stomach, watching Trent across the yard with an expression I hadn't seen on her since she was 17, and I caught her sneaking in past curfew, terrified and guilty all at once. I walked over. "You doing all right, sweetheart?" She jumped like I'd startled her out of a trance. "Yeah, Dad, just tired, chasing the girls all day. See, but I know that face. I've known that face since she was 3 years old and broke Carol's favorite lamp and tried to convince us the cat did it." "Megan," I said quietly, "what exactly did Trent tell you about the 40,000? Her eyes went glassy immediately. "Dad, he told me you offered it. He said you called him, actually, and said you wanted to invest in the business because you believed in him. He said it was your idea." The ground seemed to tilt under my boots. "Megan, that's not what happened. You called me. You told me the business was in trouble and Trent needed help. I never called anyone. I never offered anything until you asked me to." She stared at me, and I watched something break behind her eyes, some careful arrangement of trust rearranging itself into panic. "He told everyone it was a gift," she whispered. "He told his parents you were retiring soon and wanted to leave a legacy for the girls. He said that's why you gave it, so the business could be something Ruby and Nora inherit someday." I felt something cold slide down through my chest and settle in my gut. $40,000 of my retirement, framed as an inheritance gift I'd apparently dreamed up on my own, to a business I barely understood, given with no paperwork, no contract, nothing but a promise sworn on my granddaughters' names. I didn't make a scene. You don't do that at a party, not in front of 40 people eating brisket off paper plates. I finished my visit, hugged my granddaughters, told Megan I loved her, and drove home with my hands, so tight, on the wheel, my knuckles ached. I waited until the following week, when I knew Trent would be alone, to call him directly. "Trent, it's Walter, we need to talk about the money." There was a pause, and then that easy laugh of his, the one that always made rooms relax around him. "Walter, come on, don't tell me this is about the party thing. I was just trying to make you look good in front of everybody. You should be thanking me. I heard you telling people I gave you a gift. Trent, that was never the deal. You asked for a loan. Megan asked me for a loan. You said 90 days. Walter," he said, and his voice took on this patient, almost pitying tone, like he was explaining something to a confused child. "We're family. Family doesn't do IOUs. That's not how this works. You helped your daughter. That's what a father does. You're not going to make this about money now, are you? After everything? I want my money back, Trent. Every dollar." The silence on the other end lasted long enough that I thought he'd hung up. Then, quietly, almost gently, he said, "I think you're confused about what happened here, Walter. I think you should talk to Megan about your memory. This is exactly why families fall apart, you know. Money makes people paranoid." And then, the line went dead. I sat in my kitchen holding the phone for a long time after that. He'd made me sound unstable. He'd made $40,000 sound like a delusion I'd invented in my own head. That night I didn't sleep. I kept hearing his voice, so calm, so reasonable, twisting a spoken promise into a paranoid old man's fantasy. I had no contract, no signature. Nothing but a bank receipt showing where the money went and my own memory of a phone call nobody else had heard. I told myself I'd let it go. $40,000, I reasoned, wasn't worth blowing up my relationship with Megan and the girls. I told myself I'd absorb it the way you absorb a bad investment and move on with what was left of my life. But then the calls started. My sister phoned to say how proud she was of me for setting up those girls' future. A neighbor mentioned how generous I'd been to gift my son-in-law a fresh start. Even my son Danny, who lives 2 hours away in Wichita, called to ask why I hadn't told him I'd given Trent 40 grand as a graduation present for the business. Trent had spread the story everywhere, dressed it up in warmer and warmer language every time it got retold, until I was the beloved family patriarch handing out blessings instead of a man who'd been asked and promised and then robbed of the truth. About 3 months after the party, I ran into an old coworker of mine, Ray Delgado, at the hardware store on Memorial Drive. Ray used to work logistics with me at the distribution center, retired 2 years before I did, and always had his ear to the ground about half the businesses in Tulsa County because his nephew did commercial insurance. "Walter," he said, catching my arm near the paint aisle, "I heard you helped out your son-in-law's solar outfit." "Something like that?" I said. Ray's face changed, went careful in a way I didn't like. "Walter, I insure 2 of the crews he subcontracts. That business wasn't in trouble. They got paid out on that municipal contract back in February, full amount. I saw the paperwork myself. Whatever he told you about being desperate, it wasn't true. Not the way you're probably thinking." Topic. I stood there in the paint aisle with a can of primer in my hand, feeling the floor shift beneath me for the second time in 3 months. "Ray, are you sure?" "I'm sure. And you're not the only one, either." He borrowed $12,000 from his own business partner's father back in the fall. Told him almost the same story. Man never saw it structured as a real loan. Just family generosity, he called it. I drove home that afternoon in a kind of fog. I wasn't just a soft touch who'd been talked into helping. I was a mark. The best thing. I was a mark. A specific kind of mark, the kind who loves his daughter too much to ask hard questions, the kind whose grandchildren's names could be used as a leash. Something in me went quiet and cold and very, very clear. I sat down at my kitchen table that night with a legal pad, the same kind I used for 38 years logging delivery routes, and I started writing everything down. The date of Megan's first call, the exact words Trent had used at the party, the date of the wire transfer, Ray's name and what he'd told me. I wrote it all in the neat block letters Carol used to tease me about, and by the time I was done I had 4 pages. The next morning I called Megan, and I told her everything Ray had told me. I could hear her breathing, get shallow and fast on the other end. "Dad, that can't be right." He told me the contract fell through. He told me we almost lost the house. "Megan, I need you to think carefully. Has he asked you for money too? Anything from your own accounts?" "MAT. The silence that followed told me the answer before she said a word. "He took $18,000 out of my 401k loan program in January," she finally whispered. "He said it was for payroll. He said he'd replace it before there were any penalties. $18,000 from his own wife's retirement, on top of my $40,000, all while the business, according to Ray, had been sitting on a fully paid municipal contract the whole time." "Sweetheart," I said, keeping my voice as steady as I could manage, though my hands were shaking. "I need you to trust me on something. I'm not going to confront him yet. I need you to act like everything is normal for a little while longer. Can you do that?" She was quiet for a long moment. Then, small and scared, she said, "Okay, Dad, I trust you." That was all I needed to hear. The next week I went to see an old friend of mine, a lawyer named Curtis Boone, who'd handled small business contracts for the distribution company for years before he retired into a private practice. I laid out everything on his desk, the legal pad, the bank receipt, Ray's contact information, dates and phone calls reconstructed as best I could. Curtis read through it twice, his glasses pushed up on his forehead. "Walter, you've got a real problem here, and I mean that both ways. You've got a genuine case for fraud, misrepresentation, at minimum unjust enrichment, but you've also got no signed agreement, and he's going to say every dollar was a gift. That's going to be an uphill fight in court, and it'll take money and time you may not want to spend. I'm not trying to sue him into the ground, Curtis. I want the truth out. I want people to know what he actually did, not the fairy tale he's been telling. One, pos, a, I, one, I. Curtis leaned back, folding his hands over his stomach the way he always did when he was thinking. There's a difference between winning in court and winning in the world you actually live in, Walter. Sometimes the second one matters more to a man your age. You want my advice? Document everything. Send him one formal demand letter through my office, so there's a legal record, and then let the truth do the rest of the work. People believe evidence more than they believe accusations. I left his office that afternoon with a plan for the first time since Megan's first phone call, and it felt like setting down a bag of wet sand I'd been carrying for months. 2 weeks later, Curtis's office sent Trent a formal letter demanding repayment of the $40,000, citing the verbal agreement, the timeline, and the wire transfer records as evidence of a loan rather than a gift. I didn't hear anything back for 11 days. Then Megan called me, crying so hard I could barely understand her. "Dad, he's furious. He says you're trying to destroy his reputation. He says everyone's going to think he's a thief now." "He is a thief, Megan," I said, gently as I could. "I'm not trying to destroy him. I'm trying to get the truth back where it belongs." The following Sunday, I did something I'd never done in 64 years of trying to keep the peace in my own family. I hosted a cookout at my house and I invited Trent's parents, his sister, a few of the family friends who'd praised me at that party for my generosity, and Ray, who agreed to come and say, in his own words, what he'd told me in that paint aisle. I did not invite Trent. The afternoon was warm, the same kind of easy Oklahoma sunshine as that first party, and for the first hour we ate ribs and talked about nothing much at all. Then, once the plates were mostly empty and the conversation had slowed, I stood up at the head of my own backyard table, my heart hammering so hard I could feel it in my ears. "I want to thank you all for coming," I said, and my voice came out steadier than I felt. "I need to say something I should have said months ago." End quote. The yard went quiet. Trent's mother set down her sweet tea. "You've all heard that I gave Trent $40,000 as a gift, right? Some kind of legacy for my granddaughters. I let that story stand for a long time because I didn't want to make trouble at Megan's expense. But it isn't true. Trent called it a gift after the fact. What actually happened is my daughter called me in tears, told me the business was about to collapse, and I wired $40,000 on a promise it would be repaid in 90 days. Trent's father started to stand, his face reddening. "Walter, that's a hell of an accusation to make at a backyard cookout." "It is," I said, "which is why I'm not the only one saying it." I nodded to Ray, who set down his plate and stood by. Ray told them plainly what he'd told me in the hardware store, the paid municipal contract, the timeline that didn't match Trent's story, the other family he knew of who'd been asked for money under nearly identical circumstances. I watched Trent's mother's face go from pink to white as Ray talked. I watched his father sit back down slowly, like his legs had stopped working. "I have the wire transfer records," I said, when Ray finished. "I have a demand letter from my attorney. I have dates. What I don't have is a single lie in anything I've told you today." First, nobody said much after that. A few people left early. Trent's sister hugged me on her way out and told me she believed me, which I hadn't expected and which meant more than I let on. The weeks after that cookout were rough ones. Trent tried calling around, tried to paint me as a bitter old man who couldn't stand to see his son-in-law succeed, tried to convince people I was jealous of his lifestyle. But the story didn't have anywhere solid to stand anymore. Not with Ray's account backing mine, not with the demand letter on file, not with Megan quietly confirming to her own mother-in-law, in private, that yes, it had always been a loan. Trent's business began to fray at the edges within a month. 2 subcontractors pulled out over what Ray later told me were trust issues. A client backed out of a signed deal after hearing rumors about how Trent handled money owed to family. Then, one evening in early October, Megan called me, and this time her voice wasn't shaking with fear. It was flat, exhausted, and somehow lighter than it had been in months. "Dad, he's gone. He packed a bag last night and left. Said he needs, quote, space to figure things out. Didn't even look at the girls when he walked out." "Are you all right?" I asked. "I will be," she said, and there was something new in her voice, something solid. "I filed for a legal separation this morning. My lawyer says I have a strong claim on the retirement money he took, especially with everything you documented." A month later, an envelope showed up in my mailbox with no return address. Inside was a cashier's check for the full $40,000. Along with a short handwritten note that said, "Only I'm sorry it took this long." I never framed it or celebrated it. I just deposited it and moved on, because by then the money had stopped being the point. What mattered was that my granddaughters would grow up knowing their grandfather stood up for the truth instead of swallowing it to keep a fragile peace. What mattered was that Megan learned, at 34 years old, that she was allowed to ask hard questions of the man she married, and that doing so wasn't a betrayal of love, it was a requirement of it. I think about that spring evening on my porch step sometimes, the sun going down orange over the Ferguson's fence, the exact moment I agreed to send $40,000 into the world on nothing but a promise. I don't regret helping my daughter. I never will, but I've learned that love without honesty isn't really love at all. It's just a story somebody else gets to tell about you, and you don't even get a say in how it ends. If you're listening to this and you've ever handed something precious to someone you trusted, only to watch them rewrite what you gave into something smaller, or stranger, or entirely unrecognizable, I want you to hear this. You are allowed to ask for the truth back. You are allowed to put your name back on your own story. And no matter how long it takes, no matter how many family dinners get uncomfortable along the way, the truth is always worth more than the silence that used to protect it. Go call your family tonight. Tell them you love them, but never, ever let somebody else decide what your kindness meant.